Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. I wanted to come live and talk to you today about training errors, common training errors and how we can fix them. And this is an important topic because we do think in running injury as much as 60 to 70% of running injury is caused by training error. So if we can get an athlete to change their training, there's a good chance we might reduce their injury risk. So it is an important topic. I will mention as well, we've got loads of other free video resources for you. So do click on the link that I've mentioned in the title. It's also there in our Instagram page as well to go and check out our videos on Achilles tendinopathy, on lateral hip pain and back pain in athletes. We've got a lot of resources to keep you going at the moment. Do dive into those. Now, before we talk about these 6 common training errors and how we can address them, it's worth remembering that this isn't just a question of telling an athlete what to do. Like we talked about in our previous videos on what to do when athletes won't stop running, we have to think about what's driving their training as well. And we have to try and help them to understand why we're suggesting they train differently and help them to see the link between changes in their training and the development of injury. Many runners, and I would include myself in this at times, believe that more running means better results. And that isn't always the way. Actually, sometimes we're better focusing on recovery. And in many cases, it's consistency that gets us good results. So it's not that helpful for a runner's performance to absolutely go for it for 3 or 4 weeks and then have to stop because they've picked up an injury. They're much better building gradually, working consistently, and then they're going to get the results. All their hard work will pay off. So let's talk about our first of these 6 training errors. The classic that you'll all be very familiar with. Number 1 training error, too much too soon. Now, this tends to be a rapid increase in things like your training volume, how much you're training, the training frequency, how often that you're training, or the training intensity that you're pushing too hard. And an analogy I like actually is that a running injury is like a hangover, in that it's usually caused by too much too quickly, and as soon as we feel better, we do it all again. Now, this is very much like a hangover because we do tend to do it all again, and that's true of running injuries. We tend to repeat the same mistakes over and over, which is why it's really important to help runners to understand this, to try and change that training behavior. So to help them to recognize how they can change their training in a way that's less likely to lead to injury, but will be more likely to improve their performance. Now, usually what I would suggest is we change one thing at a time and we make that change relevant to their particular goal. So we either increase training volume or increase training frequency, so we're training more often, or we increase training intensity. I don't usually recommend increasing lots of things at once. Think about the key area for you as a runner at this moment, and that's the area that we're going to change first. And we can want to give people some kind of guidance in terms of how they may change as well. And one thing that's often popular and used with changing training volume is the 10% rule. Now, you'll be familiar with this. What it suggests is that we take our total training volume, maybe in terms of miles per week, and increase that by a maximum of 10% per week. So if you're doing 10 miles this week in total, you might increase by 10% to 11 miles next week. Now, this, I think, has some usefulness in runners. It has its limitations, though. It's useful because it's simple and it offers a level of guidance, and I think sometimes that's what people need. I've known runners literally double their mileage or more from one week to the next. To having some kind of grounding point does help, but we must recognize that it's not going to be something that works for absolutely everyone. Now, I've adapted this because one of the problems with the 10% rule is it doesn't work very well when you're doing lower mileage. So if you're only doing a few minutes or a few kilometers, adding 10% per week will take forever. So if your total weekly distance is low, maybe roughly 0 to 10 kilometers, perhaps you can increase a little bit more, perhaps up to 30% per week. If your total weekly distance is maybe 10 to 20 kilometers, maybe you'll tolerate a 20% increase per week. But when you're getting higher, maybe over 20 kilometers per week, you probably want to stick closer to that 10% rule. And if you're right up at the top end of your mileage, some runners will be doing in excess of 100 miles a week, you may not want to tack another 10% on top of that. It's very much got to be dependent on your goals, the time frame you've got to achieve those goals, and also your individual ability. Some runners will not tolerate big changes in their training, and you get to know this as you get to know your athletes. Some runners, however, are much more resilient and much better able to cope with those changes, particularly if they've got a good chronic training history. They've been training for a number of years. They'll tolerate greater fluctuations in training. But those without that, those particularly coming back from injury, they haven't built up that chronic training load, they're not going to tolerate such big fluctuations in their acute training as in what they're doing now. So that's number one, too much too soon, and we're going to solve it by giving people guidance in terms of how quickly they can change their training. Number two, too much high intensity training. Now, this can be driven by these sort of beliefs that many of us runners have, that in order to get good results, you've got to push yourself hard in every single session. So they push, and they end up picking up an injury as a result. But actually, for endurance athletes, the athletes that I'm mainly seeing running 5K, 10K, half marathon, marathon and above, actually their focus is more on low intensity training to build that endurance base, with maybe one or two good quality high intensity training sessions in there per week. And there's some recommendations from the literature, people like Stephen Seiler's work, that perhaps we should be aiming at maybe 80% of our training in terms of training time being low intensity in endurance athletes, and as little as 20% being high intensity training. So your tempo runs, steady state runs, interval sessions would all fall into that kind of higher intensity training bracket. Now, the wisdom behind that says that we get a lot of the benefits from our training while training at low intensities. We don't need to push ourselves really hard to get that benefit, and it may not be better for performance to do more than 20% of your total training at a high intensity, in which case we're better off sticking at lower intensity work that allows us to continue training without pushing so hard that we pick up an injury. Number three, poor weekly planning. Now, I think it's really important to encourage athletes to think about how one session may interact with the next session, and how their training over time will start to influence itself. You may push really, really hard in one session, but does it actually influence the quality of what you get out of the next session? So it's a good idea to get people to think about their training. And here's an example of a schedule where there hasn't been a great deal of thought put into it, and you see this quite often. So on the Monday, we've got a strength training session. Fine, big fan of strength training, but it's followed on Tuesday by the longest run of the week. So trying to do that long run on legs that are tired from a strength session the day before. On Wednesday, then, we've got intervals, tough session, high intensity session on legs that are doubly tired now, because so far this week they've done strength work and a long run as well. Then coming in on Thursday, we've got a CrossFit session. A fan of CrossFit, I think it certainly can be a part of a runner's schedule, but these legs are probably feeling pretty ropey already. To be doing some potentially quite high intensity lifting work is going to be tough. Then Friday, another strength session and a tough tempo run on the Saturday before a spin session, which leads you back into the next week. Spin sessions, again, often really hard. So there's no recovery in this schedule, and there's not much thought about how one session is going to influence the next. So could we have a nice recovery day on the Monday, perhaps, to leave this person nice and fresh for their long run? Could we move those intervals to later in the week so they're not trying to do it on legs that are tired from doing that longer effort? So it's just having a think about the sessions, how we plan it, where we bring in our rest till we get the best out of it, and don't just end up with an exhausted athlete who's actually finding their results as suffering because of their training program. So have a bit of a think about it, work with your athlete. We need to be pragmatic with this to find a way that works for them. Number 4 on our 6 common training errors is rapid return to running after a break. Now, this is really common in January and February, where people have had some time off over Christmas, they've had one too many mince pies, and they come back and they rush back to their training that they were doing pre-Christmas. And their body's no longer used to that level of training, so it tends to overload and irritate the tissues, and they have a setback as a result. Really common in other sports as well. We see pre-season in team sports being a time where injuries peak, where athletes take time off over the summer, they come back and they're beasted is often the term, they're pushed really hard, their body's not used to it, and they break down as a result. So the answer here is to make sure you let your athletes know. If you want to take time off running, brilliant, no problem. But just ease back into it as you come back in. Make those first couple of weeks nice and easy. Gradually build that mileage up again. And then you're going to be better able to cope with that and more likely to stick with your running. Number 5 is not individualizing training. Now, something we do, it's human nature, is we compare ourselves to others, and we tend to compare ourselves to people that are doing more. We look at runners that are training much harder, much faster, more frequently, that are pushing out more, impressive times. But we don't really think about what we're capable of. And actually, our training very much needs to be based on us. Our capabilities, the level we're at the moment, our previous injury history, what's going on in our life. We can't expect to train like an elite athlete when they actually have a very different lifestyle. Those professional athletes don't have little things like work to deal with. They don't have to do a full-time job in many cases. So they can plan this training, and they've been training at a high level for many years. We're not in the same boat. Now, I've got runners that often say, well, I want to train harder because it's what my mate Dave does. But I've got a message for people like that. Don't be like Dave. Be like you. It's not about your friends and the level that they're pushing to. It's about what your goals are and making sure your training is aiming towards achieving those goals and is at a level that works for you. And last but not least on our list here, amongst our training errors, is inadequate recovery. Now, a message I often try and give to my runners is, if you want to train hard, you've got to recover harder. You've got to put as much effort and energy into planning your recovery as you do into planning your training. So think about that in terms of your week. Where can you put those recovery days to allow you to recover from those tougher sessions? Could you put them in after your longer runs or before your interval sessions? Think about the longer time frames over the next sort of 3 or 4 weeks. So I often recommend putting in a recovery week roughly every 4th week. So we plan to build for 3 weeks, maybe roughly 10% per week. And in the 4th week, we have a recovery week where we drop down the training volume, typically by between about 10 and 30%, but we maintain some intensity in there. So we reduce the fatigue levels, but we maintain the performance and sharpness by keeping some speed work in there. But it's all about then planning over time how we're going to bring in this recovery and including it. Because if you think it will just happen, it often doesn't. Quite often, in fact, recovery is what gets sacrificed as we train more. We get up early, so we lose out on sleep in order to squeeze an extra session in, or we train into the evening to accommodate our working patterns, and again, we lose out on sleep and recovery as well. And on that topic, if there's one thing that you want to focus on for your recovery, it is sleep. Sleep is the best recovery tool we have. Most research recommends to aim for about 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. The harder you train, the more you may need to focus on sleep quantity and quality. So if you want to push yourself hard with your training, plan in that recovery and really think about how you can optimize your sleep, because it's been found to improve performance and it may well reduce injury risk as well. Okay, so a quick recap on those 6 common training errors. 1, too much too soon. 2, too much high intensity. 3, poor weekly planning. 4, rapid return after a break. Number 5, not individualizing training. And number 6, inadequate recovery. And I think we can fix these by working closely with our athletes, knowing what their goals are and helping them to understand why it's important that their training is at a level they can cope with and progresses in a sensible way towards their goals, because then they're going to get the best results out of it. They're going to stay training consistently and hopefully stay injury free. Okay, thanks very much for listening. As I mentioned, we've got links to more video resources there. Great videos on Achilles tendinopathy, lateral hip pain, and back pain in athletes as well. So do go enjoy those videos, and I'll catch up with you later. Bye for now.